Doctors of Reddit, what patient made you go how the F are you even alive? I was on home call for her in a small town. Got a call from the nurse one night and she was like, "M's brought someone in here and they think she might be dead." I was like, "Well, is she?" She was like, "I don't know." This was a seasoned RN, by the way, so I was like, "Well, guess we are treating this as a code blue kind of situation." So without any further information, I jump into my car and rush over to the hospital. Once I got there, I realized why the triage nurse was so confused. In the trauma bay lay what appeared to be skeletonized remains under a blanket. The person felt warm to touch, so I opened their eye, and a yellow, wrinkled, shrunken eyeball stared at me and then suddenly moved. Potassium of 1, for those familiar with lab values. The backstory was extreme self-neglect / depression combined with carriage neglect. Weighed in at 67 pounds at a height of about 5 feet 5. We actually resuscitated her, very aggressively and unbelievably. After about 8 liters of fluid, she started speaking a word or two at a time and recognized her daughter. A couple pictures of me before and after brain surgeries were on the front page around this time last year. The mortality rate for acute sideral hematomas is 50-90%. Of those who live, approximately 20-30% regain any brain functioning. Due to the sideral hematoma, the bleeding in my skull was so severe that I also had cranial herniation. My brain tilted 5 millimeters, causing my brainstem to compress into my spinal cord. That I not only lived, but woke up and recovered well enough to go back to work / get married / travel the world / return to baseline physically is a straight up medical miracle. I'm still in touch with the neurosurgeon who was on call at the hospital that day, and he says the same thing. As a med student on my emergency rotation, I had a guy brought in who had fallen off a 7th or 8th floor balcony and landed on his head. Essentially door, and we couldn't get a blood pressure when he got to the hospital. As a student, my job was to basically stand to the side and squeeze the bajillion bags of blood that went into this dude. His cervical spine was essentially dust on the initial cord scan we got. I figured he probably wouldn't have made it, but about a month later I'm now on my IQ rotation and I see this guy awake and conscious. Pretty crazy. I work in trauma and once had a guy fall off a roof. He said he remembered hitting the bars on the scaffolding on the way down. We originally thought he'd fractured his femur, but nope, just a small hematoma. He was in bed next to a man who had broken his ribs and had a small C-spine fracture when he fell forward picking up his keys. Currently in residency, but this was a patient I saw in medical school. This one has more to do with a patient's past medical history instead of anything acute. Had one patient in one of my internal medicine rotations who was admitted for hip surgery who was one of the nicest, sweetest people I've ever met. Her surgery was pretty routine and there were no complications. In her past medical history, she was diagnosed with stage 4 endometrial cancer that had spread to her brain. Apparently she had undergone chemo, radiation, primary tumor resection, and surgery to remove the brain met. She remained cancer-free since that period. The fact that she had undergone that whole ordeal and appeared to be mostly healthy and was in remission from her cancer really blew my mind. Lady in her mid-30s was in the clinic for a 1-week follow-up post-foot amputation, diabetes. She was admitted straight from the clinic because her blood glucose was 600 mg/dl, normal is 80 to 120, and the wound was severely infected. We used super concentrated doses of insulin to bring it back to the 200s. She was on strict diet restrictions and we couldn't figure out how it wouldn't drop any lower than 250. Turns out her kids, teens, had been sneaking giant 64-ounce sodas and candy bars into the hospital, literally 1 week after we chopped her foot off because of uncontrolled diabetes. Not exactly a case of, how the fuck did you survive that trauma / disease, but, how the fuck do you even function on your own? My dad is 87. He had prostate, liver, bowel, colon, and skin cancer. For the skin cancer he had lots of reconstructive surgeries. His whole tibia region and the back of his hands. Every year he has to have at least one skin lesion removed. He had a couple of heart attacks and then a sextuple bypass surgery. He also had a big pneumonia, a huge abscess and a small stroke. His doctor wants to see him every 6 months. I think just to be amazed that he's still walking around. We had a guy with a major aortic dissection one night. From the bedside ultrasound, he looked like he had already bled out. He had some chest pain, but he was alert and oriented, and we were shocked he was even still alive. He absolutely shouldn't have been with how much blood we saw and the size of the dissection. We called the surgeon in, who was really blunt, and explained to the guy he was probably going to die in surgery. He was a young guy, like late 40s. He was on a business trip, and it was completely unexpected. He kept trying to call his wife, but it was like 2 AM and she wasn't answering. He just wanted to talk and tell her goodbye. It was actually pretty devastating to watch. Meanwhile he's so coherent and alert, as if he isn't actively bleeding out and dying. Most patients we would get in the same situation wouldn't be conscious, or would already be dead. They swooped him off to surgery before he could contact his wife, and the dude lived. Remembering that story got me through a lot of tough years in the air, because I think it just reminded me that hope and good outcomes are still out there. During residency, my IQ patient had to have his chest reopened less than an hour after 6-hour open heart CABG surgery. He needed 12 units of blood, his heart massage then shocked 4 times. Cardiothoracic surgeon and the IQ operating, because no time to go back down to or. Was an illicit drug abuser and alcoholic. Nurses called him the cockroach. I checked in on him for 4 weeks. He was unresponsive every day. On week 20 we had to consult and to take maggots out of his nose. I was sure he was a goner after that. Week 3 passed, no change. Week 4, day 24 I believe, at 6 AM, he opens his eyes. I was shocked. He has a permanent tracheostomy now, but somehow is alive. A guy I took care of during my residency. Fucking cyborg. I was the chief on trauma. Got a page about a patient en route with a stab wound to the chest. When the patient rolled into the trauma bay, he had no pulse. He had been stabbed in his left upper chest, 3 centimeters below clavicle. He got an thoracotomy. If you want to feel like a badass, then do an thoracotomy. We were able to cross clamp his aorta. We took him right to the OR. We oversewed one small artery below his rib, then transported him to the ICU still intubated. 8 hours later he was extubated and wanting breakfast. Seriously, dude? He was dead 10 hours before. He was also a complete asshole. No wonder someone stabbed him. My mom's a doctor. I asked her about this when it came up on Reddit. When my mom was in her IQ cycle during internship, man with police officers behind him came in the IQ. The man was perfectly fine and walking, so my mom and her colleagues were confused. The officers showed them a picture of a crumpled metal piece, which was a car. It didn't look like a car at all, just metal trash. The officers told my mom and her colleagues that they rescued a patient from the car, which was lit on fire only a few seconds after they rescued him. The patient didn't have a single scar on him, was perfectly fine, and got his name around the hospital for being immortal. Patient here. When I was 2 I was being treated for asthma due to wheezing, labored breathing, etc. One night it got exceptionally bad, so my mom took me to the ER. They put me face down to do a cord scan. This was 1990, and when they were done, they turned me back over, and I was blue, had stopped breathing. Cord revealed a volleyball-size mass in my chest. Emergency surgery revealed the mass was what would have been my twin. It kept growing inside my ribcage and finally had nowhere to go in my toddler body, so it cut off my airway. It had fingernails, hair, appendages, everything but major organs. Made a full recovery. Healthy 31-year-old now. Zero asthma. Only remnant of that night is a scar that goes from the center of my chest to the center of my back. Airlifted pregnant female with GSW to the head. Arrived intubated and non-responsive with the bullet lodged in her right occipital lobe. Self-extubated the next day and left the hospital against medical advice 2 days after that with only minor visual deficits. Unbelievable. My father's doctor couldn't believe her. He didn't need to amputate his feet and he was still alive. Dad had brittle diabetes. His pancreas would kick in and out due to a congenital deformity. At 82, he had significant heart issues, including angina, enlarged heart and clogged arteries. One day, his feet went black. Not just bluish or grey, black as charcoal. Rushed to emergency. We were told they would amputate, but to say our goodbyes. Dad refused surgery. Said he'd rather be dead at his age. Hours later, his feet were pink. We took him home that morning. Doctor actually apologized for upsetting us, but said he'd never seen anything like it. Patient here. When I was 7 I had horrible asthma. My mom often lied in my bed with me and listened to my breathing. One night she fell asleep and jerked awake in the wee hours of the night and found I was not breathing. Goes to the ER immediately because it was only like 10 minutes away. Not sure what happened while there, what tests they did, but I was declared dead. In the morning I woke up, asked who I believe was a nurse where I was, and she started crying and called in my mother, who hadn't slept all night. The doctor said they didn't know how the fuck I was still alive. Now 16 and haven't had any hospital worthy complications since. And god damn it, my mom is the most amazing and loving person on this green earth. Not a doctor, but was the patient. When I was in boot camp I developed an upper respiratory infection during second phase. I didn't want to get dropped back a platoon, so I gutted through. Got back and went to sick call where they treated me for a host of things. When they x-rayed my chest, the doctors came out with my films and literally asked, "How the hell are you still alive? Your lungs are so full of mucus you should be dead." Turned into walking pneumonia at some point. I also had athlete's foot that turned into cellulitis and my last wisdom tooth yanked. So the combination of meds they had me on was enough that I don't even remember that week at all. So not the doctor but the patient. I had a super bad allergic reaction that was a specific type of allergic reaction that was deadly on its own. It would have been deadly if I had only taken a small bit of the medicine I was allergic to, but the doctor that prescribed it accidentally prescribed about 10x more than what the maximum dose for that medication is supposed to be. So not only was I super allergic, I was also overdosed on what I was allergic to. So that led into weeks of me being in the ICU and doctors thinking I had about a 3% chance of surviving at best. Every time I was conscious and had family visiting, a doctor would tell me to make the most of it because I probably wasn't going to make it for their next visit. Eventually I somehow recovered, but for about 2 years after I was still regularly going to several doctors to make sure different things were okay that were affected by it. Every single doctor I went to would hug me and would have other doctors and nurses come in and say something like, "Hey, you don't remember this because you were unconscious at the time, but I helped restart your heart," or "I was the person that vacuumed the blood and pus out of your throat that was blocking your air path," and they were just all amazed that I made it. It's been about 8 years since it all went down, and I've run into several of the doctors and nurses around the city, and they still recognize me and still hug me. It amazes me how in such a large city with such a huge hospital that gets the most extreme medical cases from around the world, that they still remember me being there. I'm not a doctor, but I did meet a patient who fell from a 5-story building, landed on his upper back, woke up in the hospital the next morning, and got up walking around like nothing ever happened. Barely a scratch on him. Think about it every time I'm in a building with at least 5 stories, just looking down like, how in the world did this guy walk away from that like he fell off his bike and took a nap? Actually, I've seen worse injuries from someone falling off a bike, lol. I had a patient in the emergency room who had been involved in an awful car accident where firefighters and paramedics spent an hour trying to get him out of his car. Reportedly, he attempted to walk to the ambulance, and when he arrived he was awake and talking. Confused speech, but still. Then paramedics signaled the back of his head to me. His skull was popped open on the back so much that I could see inside. We paged the brain surgeon immediately, and the patient was taken directly to the operation theater. Months later I heard from my colleague that he was still alive and had no damages other than some occasional balance problems. I'm not a doctor, but I do know a story that surprised most doctors. I'm currently 19 years old. My childhood was quite normal at first, but everything became quite dark when my grandfather got cancer in his testicles. When he started chemotherapies, everything was very hard for him and for the whole family. My cousins and I used to visit him after lessons. A couple of years passed, and our grandfather recovered from cancer, but the smile was erased when they told us that he had metastases, so the cancer spread to the part of the rectum. He had to start chemotherapies again. Luckily the cancer was not as serious as the previous one. Although it sounds strange, my grandfather survived and cured of the second cancer after a year. There were no longer any forecasts of any other terminal illness. At 17, my grandmother passed away, which made our grandfather move with my family, but being quite impatient, he would go out from time to sunbathe and feed the birds. He went to the park by bus. One had done at night and my grandfather had not come home. He took the bus, but the driver was drunk. The bus crashed. 4 people died and 7 survived, of which my grandfather was. We did not realize that he had disappeared that night. The next morning we found him in the hospital sitting as if nothing had happened. We all burst into tears as he complained about the decanter while laughing. My mother joked that God had forgotten to take our grandfather to heaven. This year my grandfather got the flu and we went to the doctor. After writing the medical history, the doctor almost dropped his eyes when he saw that he was still alive. Not a doctor, but my future brother-in-law was definitely one of those cases. When he was about 5 and my fiancée was 10, their family went to go visit their grandparents who own a significant amount of land. Grandparents gifted my fiancée one of those mini 4-wheelers for kids. This thing did a significant amount of speed. I don't recall how fast my fiancée said it would go, and grandparents obviously made a rule that brother-in-law couldn't ride on it alone and both had to wear helmets at all times. Well, brother-in-law really wanted to ride it and snuck on when nobody was looking and just took the fuck off. About 30 feet before slamming straight into back end of the grandparents' Suburban. From what my fiancé has told me, brother-in-law cannot remember any of this accident. It was bad. He cracked his skull, tons of stitches all over his face, knocked out some baby teeth, and wore headgear for almost a year because he fucked up his head. The doctors told my in-laws that it's amazing he survived and a miracle that he didn't have permanent brain damage. He's a pretty cool kid now at 18 and will be my fiancé's best man. Don't forget to consider the idea to maybe think about potentially subscribing. Peace.